Welcome back. This is Chapter 4 The Enemy, written by Pharah. And now I'm going to explain this chapter to you. So here we go. It's very unfortunate that this man should have washed up on your doorstep, he said irritably. I feel it so myself, Sadao said gently. So here, this line say, that the general with irritation remarked it as an unfortunate event that the enemy was washed up on his doorstep. Sadao reacted instantly, saying that he thought it the same way. Second para. It would be best if he could be quietly killed, the general said. Not by you, but by someone who does not know him. I have my own private assassins. Suppose I send 2 of them to your house tonight, or better, any night. You need know nothing about it. It is now warm. What would be more natural than that you should leave the outer partition of the white man's room open to the garden while he sleeps? Okay, so here this line say that the general, in his opinion, suggested that the enemy should be quietly eliminated by some unknown element. Then he offered to send 2 of his assassins, either on that night or any other night of which he did not know. And since it was summer, it was very natural to leave the outer partition of his room open while he lay asleep. Certainly, it would be very natural, Sadao agreed. In fact, it is so left open every night. Good, the general said, yawning. They are very capable assassins. They make no noise, and they know the trick of inward bleeding. If you like, I can even have them remove the body. Sadao considered. That perhaps would be best, Excellency. He agreed, thinking of Hannah. So here this line say that Sadao readily agreed upon the idea and informed that it was in fact left open always at night. The general expressed his joy and then again informed him that the assassins were very capable force, accomplishing their work silently and armed with the knowledge of inflicting inward bleeding. Sadao even wished if the body could be removed by them. Thinking of Hannah, he consented upon getting the body removed too. He left the general's presence then and went home, thinking over the plan. In this way the whole thing would be taken out of his hands. He would tell Hannah nothing, since she would be timid at the idea of assassins in the house, and yet certainly such persons were essential in an absolute state such as Japan was. How else could rulers deal with those who oppose them? So here this line say that Sadao left the palace thinking over the entire plan and then realized its advantage for him, as there was zero involvement of him. He then decided not to disclose anything of the plan because that would terrorize his wife Hannah. But at the same time he endorsed the idea of having assassins to oppress opponents in Japan and absolute state then. The next para. He refused to allow anything but reason to be the atmosphere of his mind as he went into the room where the American was in bed. But as he opened the door, to his surprise he found the young man out of bed and preparing to go into the garden. So here this line say that now Sadao made his mind up to be practical and not sentimental as he went into the room of the American. There he found him getting ready to go out to the garden when the door was open. The next para. "What is this?" he exclaimed. "Who gave you permission to leave your room?" "I'm not used to waiting for permission," Tom said gaily. "Gosh, I feel pretty good again. But will the muscles on this side always feel stiff?" "Is it so?" Sadao inquired, surprised. "He forgot all else. Now I thought I had provided against that," he murmured. He lifted the edge of the man's shirt and gazed at the healing scar. "Massage may do it," he said, "if exercise does not." So here, this line say that Sadao shouted at the American and asked as who allowed him to leave his room. American replied cheerfully that he had never learned to wait for permission. He was delighted over his good health, but complained stiffness of muscle. Sadao looked surprised and said he had been given every kind of medicine necessary. Examining the heel, that is a healing wound, he prescribed massage if exercise failed. "It won't bother me much," the young man said. His young face was gaunt under the stubbly blonde beard. "Say, doctor, I've got something I want to say to you. If I hadn't met a Jap like you, well, I wouldn't be alive today. I know that." So here this line say that the young American was least worried about his stiff muscles to try massaging as prescribed by Dr. Sadao at that moment. But his sickly appearance was the result of rough blonde beard he had. Here he wished to thank him for not being like other Japanese. He owed his life to him. Second para. Sadao bowed, but he could not speak. "Sure, I know that," Tom went on. His big thin hands gripping a chair were white at the knuckles. "I guess if all the Japs were like you, there wouldn't have been a war." So here these lines suggest that Sadao had no words to offer here. He only bowed for his nice words. He went on with his thoughts, gripping a chair now for support with his big thin hands. And then he relinquished all possibilities of war, provided all Japanese were like him. Next spot. "Perhaps," Sadao said with difficulty. "And now I think you had better go back to bed." He helped the boy back into bed and then bowed good night his head. So here this line say that Sadao could only express his uncertainty over his remark, and then, suggesting him to go back to bed, helped him into it and bowed, bidding him good night. Next part. Sadao slept badly that night. Time and time again he woke, thinking he heard the rustling of footsteps, the sound of a twig broken or a stone displaced in the garden, a noise such as men might make who carried a burden. So here, these lines say that night Sadao could not get a sound sleep, as his mind went repeatedly to the thought of assassins entering the house and killing the American. So even a faint sound alerted him. Next para. The next morning, he made the excuse to go first into the guest room. If the American were gone, he then could simply tell Hannah that so the general had directed. But when he opened the door, he saw at once that there, on the pillow, was the saggy blonde head. He could hear the peaceful breathing of sleep, and he closed the door again quietly. So here, this line say that next morning, the other morning, Sadao had to look for an excuse to be the first one to visit him, to find out if the plan could fully be executed or not. And if so, he would let Hannah know of the orders from the general. But what he discovered was something he wasn't expecting. He lay sleeping there peacefully, and so the door was closed quietly back again. The next para. He is asleep, he told Hannah. He's almost well to sleep like that. He is asleep, he told Hannah. He's almost well to sleep like that. What shall we do with him? Hannah whispered her old refrain. Sadao shook his head. I must decide in a day or two, he promised. So here, these lines say that while returning, he informed Hannah of his progress, pretending he went there being a doctor. Here Hannah repeated her old question, to which he promised to decide the matter in a day or two. The next para now. But certainly, he thought, the second night must be the night. There rose a wind that night, and he listened to the sounds of bending bows and whistling partitions. Hannah woke too. Ought we not go and close the sick man's partition? She asked. So here, these lines say that on the second night would be the doomsday for the American, he thought. And at night there started a wind which created a lot of sounds to which Sadao was listening keenly. It disturbed Hannah's sleep. She got up and suggested that they should go and close the partition of sick man's room. Now the next para. No, Sadao said. is able to do it for himself. But the next morning the American was still there. Then the third night, of course, must be the night. The wind changed to quiet rain, and the garden was full of the sound of dripping eaves and running springs. Sadao slept a little better, but he woke at the sound of a crash and leaped to his feet. So here these lines say that Sadao declined the suggestion, saying the American was capable of doing it. Next morning saw the same story getting repeated. Then he thought the third night would be the final one for the American. Though there was no wind, the rain this time caused some of those confusing sounds. "What was that?" Hannah cried. The baby woke at her voice and began to wail. "I must go and see." But he held her and would not let her move. "Sadao," she cried, "what is the matter with you?" "Don't go," he muttered. "Don't go." So here these lines say that the sound of the crash somewhere in the periphery of the house alerted both of them. Being alarmed, she spoke aloud, which awoke the baby, and it started to cry. She wished to go and check it out herself, but Sadao insisted. He made repeated appeals to her, which was very unusual of Sadao in such a situation. Next Pharah. His terror infected her, and she stood breathless, waiting. There was only silence. Together they crept back into the bed, the baby between them. So here these lines say that this creepy behavior of Sadao terrorized her, and both of them went back to bed silently. Next Pharah. Yet when he opened the door of the guest room in the morning, there was the young man. He was very gay and had already washed and was now on his feet. He had asked for a razor yesterday and had shaved himself, and today there was a faint color in his cheeks. "I am well," he said joyously. So here this line suggests that once again Sadao went to the guest room in the morning prior to all other, that is, prior to everyone else, like other days, and to his dismay, he was still there. He looked very happy and had already gotten up and shaved beard. His cheeks were now getting back its normal color. The American joyously announced of his well-being then. Next para. Sadao drew his kimono round his weary body. He could not, he decided suddenly, go through another night. It was not that he cared for this young man's life. No, simply it was not worth the strain. So here this line say that feeling uneasy, Sadao drew his kimono around his tired body. Suddenly he decided then that he could not bear the anxiety of yet another night. Simply, the case was not that he cared for the life of the American, but that the tension of it was not worth going through. Next para. You are well, Sadao agreed. He lowered his voice. You are so well that I think if I put my boat on the shore tonight, with food and extra clothing in it, you might be able to row to that little island not far from the coast. So, these lines say that Sadao conquered to agree to what the young American had just said. Then, lowering his voice, Sadao announced that he thought he was so well that if he had put his boat on the shore with food and clothing that night, he might be able to row to that little island off the coast. Next. It is so near the coast that it has not been worth fortifying. Nobody lives on it because in storm it is submerged. But this is not the season of storm. You could live there until you saw a Korean fishing boat pass by. They pass quite near the island because the water is many fathoms deep there. This island was so near the coast that it had never been put under surveillance, and none lived there because it went under water during storms, but luckily it was not the season of storms. He suggested that the young man could live there until he found a Korean fishing boat passing by it. These boats come near the island because water near the island was quite deep. Next para. The young man stared at him, slowly comprehending. Do I have to? He asked. I think so, Sadao said gently. You understand, it is not hidden that you are here. So here these lines say that the young man stared at him, trying to read his mind, and then asked if it was all that required. Sadao asserted, saying he believed so because his presence was not hidden from others. It was not a secret to others. The young man nodded in perfect comprehension. Okay, he said simply. Sadao did not see him again until evening. As soon as it was dark, he had dragged the stout boat down to the shore, and in it he put food and bottled water that he had bought secretly during the day, as well as 2 quails he had bought at a pawn shop. The boat he tied to a post in the water, for the tide was high. There was no moon, and he worked without a flashlight. So here, these lines say that the young man fully agreed to his proposal. For the entire day, Sadao remained busy making preparation for the journey of the young American. In the evening, the first thing he did was he pulled the heavy boat down to the shore and then stuffed it with daily essentials like food and bottled drinking water, that he bought during the day secretly. Besides those essentials, he provided 2 quills he got from a pawn shop. Since it was a high tide, the boat was tied to a post in water. He did it all in darkness, evading others' eyes. Next para now. When he came to the house, he entered as though he were just back from his work, and so Hannah knew nothing. "Yumi was here today," she said, as she served his supper. Though she was so modern, still she did not eat with him. "Yumi cried over the baby," she went on with a sigh. "She misses him so." Okay, so here this line say that after accomplishing his task, he returned home as though coming from his work, from his office. Even Hannah was not aware of all that. At the time of serving dinner, she informed, Yumi had come to see their baby. She missed it terribly and was in tears. Next, the servants will come back as soon as the foreigner is gone, Sadao said. Sadao added that all the servants would return to work once the American was gone. Next para. He went into the guest room that night before he went to bed himself and checked carefully the American's temperature, the state of wound, and his heart and pulse. The pulse was irregular, but that was perhaps because of excitement. The young man's pale lips were pressed together and his eyes burned. All his scars on his neck were red. So here this line say that after dinner he went to guest room to fully examine and take all critical readings of his body. Pulse was not regular due to excitement that was quite obvious to Sadao. Lips turned pale. He had blurry eyes. That is, his vision was blurry. Only the scars looked red. So next line, next para. I realize you are saving my life again, he told Sadao. Not at all, Sadao said. It is only inconvenience to have you here any longer. He had hesitated a good deal about giving the man a flashlight, but he had decided to give it to him after all. It was a small one, his own, which he used at night when he was called. So here this line suggests, they say, the American spoke up and said he knew he was saving his life. To this, Sadao retorted, saying that he was only trying to remove the inconvenience out of his house. Initially, he hesitated giving the American flashlight, but was finally given his own small one he used when he had to go to attend some patient. Next para. If your food runs out before you catch a boat, he said, signal me 2 flashes at the same instant the sun drops over the horizon. Do not signal in darkness, for it will be seen. If You are all right, but still there. Signal me once. You will find fresh fish easy to catch, but you must eat them raw. A fire would be seen. Okay, the young man breathed. So here, this line say, giving out instructions to the American, Sadao asked him to follow some SOPs of signaling if he ran out of food before catching a boat. He had to signal 2 flashes back to back right after sunset. It was not to be done in complete darkness, as it might be found out, and had to signal only once if he was all fine but still there. He would get plenty of fresh fish to survive, but special care needed. He had to take it raw. Fire might be a dangerous thing there. The young man had received all his instruction with was dressed now in the Japanese clothes which Sadao had given him, and at the last moment Sadao wrapped a black cloth about his blonde head. Now, Sadao said. So here, these lines say, the young American was given Japanese clothes to wear, and with a black cloth his blonde head was covered at the last moment so that he was not identified. Then Sadao asked him to proceed. Next para. The young American, without a word, shook Sadao's hands warmly, and then walked quite well across the floor and down the step into the darkness of the garden. Once, twice, Sadao saw his light flash to find his way, but that would not be suspected. He waited until from the shore there was one more flash. Then he closed the partition. That night he slept. So here, these lines say, the young man, bidding adieu, quietly shook hands with his savior, and then walked away into the darkness of the garden. Sadao observed him use flashlight only on scanty occasions to find his way. He waited flash of light from the shore, and then he closed the partition. That was the night he slept comfortably after a few nerve-wracking sleepless nights. Next para. You say the man escaped? The general asked faintly. He had been operated upon a week before, an emergency operation to which Sadao had been called in the night. For 12 hours, Sadao had not been sure the general would live. The gallbladder was much involved. Then the old man had begun to breathe deeply again and to demand food. Sadao had not been able to ask about the assassins. So far as he knew, they had never come. So here, in this line, we find Sadao in the palace, and there the general was shocked to know that the American had escaped. The general had his last emergency operation only a week ago, performed by none other than Sadao himself. Since there was some complications to it, Sadao was uncertain about the general's well-being for the next 12 hours. But he responded well to recover, because of the critical condition of his health, Sadao thought it unwise to talk about the assassins. He was sure the assassins had never come. So next part, the servants had returned and Yumi had cleaned the guest room thoroughly and had burned sulfur in it to get the white man smell out of it. Nobody said anything. Only the gardener was cross because he had got behind with his chrysanthemums. Okay, so here these lines say, the servants had consequently returned to work after American's departure. Yumi was so particular about the Americans' existence there that she wanted even to tribe his smell out of it, and so cleaned the room thoroughly and even burned sulfur in it. No one complained about a thing except the gardener, who was angry because he was late with the plantation of the flowering plant called chrysanthemums. Okay, so next part. But after a week, Sadao felt the general was well enough to be spoken to about the prisoner. Yes, Excellency, he escaped, Sadao now said. He coughed, signifying that he had not said all he might have said, but was unwilling to disturb the general further. But the old man opened his eyes suddenly. So here this line say, after a week's time, when Sadao felt the general was in good shape, he thought of speaking about the American, but was hesitant to disturb him in this regard. Boldly he spoke and said that the enemy had escaped, then coughed, indicating he was not done. That prisoner, he said with some energy, did I not promise you I would kill him for you? Okay, so here this line say, at this the old general opened his eyes all of a sudden and inquired with sudden burst of energy if it was the same enemy he promised about killing him. You did, Excellency, Sadao said. Well, the old man said in a tone of amazement. So I did, but you see, I was suffering a good deal. The truth is, I thought of nothing but myself. In short, I forgot my promise to you. So Sadao confirmed it. The general, being shocked at not fulfilling his promise, tried to downplay it, saying that since he had been suffering a great deal for some time, so it skipped off his mind, his head. His whole attention was focused on his own health. He finally accepted, forgetting about it altogether. I wondered, Your Excellency, Sadao murmured. It was certainly very careless of me, the general said. But you understand, it was not lack of patriotism or dereliction of duty. He looked anxiously at his doctor. If the matter should come out, you would understand that, wouldn't you? So here, this line suggests that at that moment, Sadao murmured that he had assumed it already. The general admitted having been careless in that matter, but at the same time he strongly rejected any thought that might proclaim him unpatriotic or which might suggest he neglected his duty. With worry-on face, he looked at the doctor. He feared if the matter came out in public, it would have serious implications for him. Next para. Certainly, Your Excellency, Sadao said. He certainly comprehended that the general was in the palm of his hand, and that, as a consequence, he himself was perfectly safe. I can swear to your loyalty, Excellency, he said to the old general, and to your zeal against the enemy. So here, this line means Sadao certainly realized that the general was in his hand now, and that there was no risk to him, to his life. He was absolutely in the safe zone. Sadao assured the general of his firm loyalty to him and maintained his faith in his actions against the enemy of the state. Next para. You are a good man, the general murmured and closed his eyes. You will be rewarded. But Sadao, searching the spot of black in the twilighted sea that night, had his reward. There was no prick of light in the dusk. No one was on the island. His prisoner was gone, safe, doubtless, for he had warned him to wait only for a Korean fishing boat. So here these lines say, the general appreciated him for being a good human being and promised a reward to him. And that evening, just after the sun had set, he looked for that signal and realized that the American was gone, since there was no signal received from the island. He was least doubtful of his safety. The only thing he had to wait for was the Korean fishing boat to arrive there. And next para now. He stood for a moment on the veranda, gazing out to the sea from whence the young man had come that other night. And into his mind, although without reason, there came other white faces he had known. The professor, at whose house he had met Hannah, a dull man, and his wife had been a silly, talkative woman in spite of her wish to be kind. He remembered his old teacher of anatomy, who had been so insistent on mercy with the knife. So here, this line suggests that being sure and certain of the American safety, Sadao stood on the veranda and looked out the sea from where the young man had appeared the other night. Then spontaneously featured the faces of those white Americans who had been a great help and support in his life during his stay in America. He remembered the professor and his talkative wife, at whose residence he met Hannah. He also remembered the professor of anatomy and his lessons on the approach to human body. Next part. And then he remembered the face of his fat and slatternly landlady. He had had great difficulty in finding a place to live in America because he was a Japanese. The Americans were full of prejudice, and It had been bitter to live in it, knowing himself their superior. How he had despised the ignorant, dirty old woman who had at last consented to house him in her miserable home. He had once tried to be grateful to her because she had in his last year nursed him through influenza, but it was difficult, for she was no less repulsive to him in her kindness. Now he remembered the youthful haggard face of his prisoner, white and repulsive. Strange, he thought. I wonder why I could not kill him. So here, these lines say, next picture that appeared in his mind was that of the fat and messy landlady. There at her house, he got a shelter after much wandering for a rent because of his race. He believed Americans were prejudiced towards others, and there he found himself better than them, and it was a tough time for him negotiating, adjusting with them. He had hatred for the landlady, though she sheltered him and nursed him while he was sick during the final year of his study. But there was something, that is, the hatred he noticed in her kindness even. At last there appeared the sickly face of that American soldier, who too was white and repulsive in nature. It was strange for him that he could not kill the American. So this is all for now.